Hey everyone, welcome to Youth Bombs. I'm Craig.
I'm Holden.
And we're the voice of young conservatives in Alachua County. There's been significant debate between the MAGA crowd and the tech crowd over H1B visas. Vivek Ramaswamy has tweeted a lengthy post about such visas and American culture. I'll read the first paragraph for us, stating that the reason top tech companies often hire foreign-born and first-generation engineers over quote-unquote Native Americans isn't because of an innate American IQ deficit, a lazy and wrong explanation. A key part of it comes down to the C word, culture. Tough questions demand tough answers, and if we're really serious about the problem, we have to confront the truth. So, Holden, how do you feel about what Vivek said as well as the recent debate over the last several days?
I think it's just very simple. It's just nobody has a right to a job. A job is something nobody has a right to. Food is something people don't have a right to. So I think this is something that we need to make very clear. An employer should be able to hire whoever they like, free of restrictions, regardless of whatever their skin color is or whatever their nationality is. So, and you're going to get paid based on your marginal productivity. So if a foreign worker has a higher marginal productivity than an American worker, and the employer would rather hire the foreign worker that has a higher marginal productivity, there's absolutely no restrictions that should be put on that, as long as they aren't a criminal or something like that. So yeah, I mean, two consenting adults should be able to hire whoever they like. Vivek's explanation. There's more to in there he talks about, well, we're going to get our butt handed to us by China, and talks about some other things. And I think that this really needs to be focused on just simply value creation. So what's going to create the most value for society? What's going to create the most output? And it's very simple. If you get the free market to decide how to employ their capital, in a capitalist system, you have private owners of capital that employ their capital how they like to. If you allow employers to employ their capital how they like to, the ones that do it very efficiently, very well, and allocate capital in a way that is very effective, they're going to keep their capital and accumulate more capital. And society will benefit from that. The economy will grow from that. And capital will accumulate the fastest from that. If you force them to hire workers that are less productive and that are not as that for whatever reason they don't want to hire them as much because they don't help them employ capital effectively, you're going to make it so that capital accumulates much slower, and you create projects that may beat the cost of capital, but if they don't have the proper talent that's not offering the high enough productivity, they might be destroying capital at that point. So you want them to be able to employ their capital how they'd like to if we want to live in a free society. So I don't think there should be the H1B1 system. There's no need for the government to decide who should be in America working and the government doesn't need to be deciding who's talented or who's not talented. Employers should decide who's talented and who's not talented. Right? The last thing I want is the government to be deciding that. Like they can't figure out virtually anything. So why would I want them trying to figure out who is a good worker and who's not a good worker, who's qualified and who's not qualified? If there's two consenting adults and they want to engage in a consensual relationship free of, they should be able to do that. So I'll just leave it at that for now.
Mm-hmm. I see it as undermining American labor. So you have people who are struggling to get a job, and the problem is that they're able to be undercut by foreign labor who comes in here, and they are generally paid about 18% less than American workers. Regarding, say, the computer science field, American workers outperform competing nations like India significantly in that margin of productivity. But we also have to look at who is being taken in through the H1B system. And while it's being marketed as the top professionals and very educated people, the interesting thing is that when we look at the public database that's out there online, we can see, for instance, cooks making $22,000 a year, 7-Eleven cashiers making $25,000 a year. So this isn't skilled labor, and it's undercutting American high schoolers and the working class who need these jobs and could have these jobs, but are instead unemployed because they're undercut by the foreign labor.
The average Indian American makes well over $100,000 a year. They're the highest earning Americans over everybody, and they're very entrepreneurial. And over 70% of them have bachelor's degrees. These people make a lot of money. They produce a lot of economic value for society. Right? Craig, it's not a zero-sum game. There's not a finite amount of jobs that exist. If that were the case, the more the population grows, the less jobs everybody would have, the more unemployment would rise. Unemployment is caused by many different factors that have virtually nothing to do with the fact that we have immigrants coming in. Immigrants create a lot of jobs for Americans. I was employed by an immigrant. Several Americans are employed by immigrants. 51% of billion-dollar companies are started by an immigrant, or at least founded by one immigrant. So, I mean, the economic benefits of immigration are insane. If you made free movement across borders, if you allowed free movement across borders, world wealth would double. The reason India is their marginal productivity is so much lower in India or Africa or many parts of Asia, generally everywhere in Asia, is simply because the capital stock of those countries is so much lower. So their marginal productivity is much lower, right? So you could produce a lot more economic value in the United States because you have much more sophisticated capital goods. So of course, your productivity is going to be way higher in the United States than it would be in virtually anywhere in the world, with very few exceptions. Maybe Scandinavian countries would have a higher capital stock per capita. But in America, you get to produce a lot of economic value because we have sophisticated capital goods. And that's not inherent to individual Haitians if you live in Haiti, or individual Indians if you live in India, that you produce less economic value, generally speaking. It's simply because you have less capital stock. So, of course, Americans are going to make more with a higher capital stock. It's not necessarily inherent to the individual Americans. Once Indian Americans make more here, where they have higher capital stock than white Americans, more than 50% more. Taiwanese Americans make much more than white Americans. Iranian Americans make much more than white Americans do. So it's not inherent to their skin color or their nationality. It's just largely just it just basically comes down to marginal productivity in a free market. Who's producing more economic value? So and the economy is not a zero-sum game.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree that it's not a zero-sum game, and that there's other jobs available. But the thing is that we shouldn't have Americans be undercut by foreign labor when there are jobs available to them that they could have, but instead we'll just take the cheap labor instead. The government should be acting in the American people's interest. But could you just explain for those who may not know what capital stock and marginal benefit is?
So capital stock would just refer to the total economic value of all of the higher order goods in an economy that are used to produce consumer goods. And so think of the economic goods that a company uses to produce the goods that they're selling. Those are going to be the capital goods and the capital stock would refer to all those goods in macroeconomic terms. But marginal productivity or marginal analysis just is economic phenomena takes place at the margin. So, for example, a worker, it's not a decision between are you going to hire all of these workers or all of the American workers or non-American or no American workers. It's a question of, okay, at this point in time, right now, with the situation I have, I make decisions at the margin. Okay, so I make a decision at the margin to partake in this podcast. A business makes a decision at the margin based on their current circumstances on whether or not they should hire an extra worker or buy extra inventory or whatever economic activity they would like to do. It takes place at the margin. All economic phenomena takes place at the margin. So nobody decides between all of the gold or all of the iron. For example, they decide, it's one of the examples that Mises used in Human Action. They decide between a given amount of gold at the margin or a given amount of iron at the margin. So that's essentially marginal analysis.
Mm-hmm. Okay, got it. And I'd also like to look at what Vivek said about culture. He mentioned how America doesn't necessarily have the same culture of super study hard all day, every day, as some other countries where we have significant immigration from. Do you believe that to be true, and do you believe that to be a factor in the workforce?
He's saying that immigrants. He's saying that immigrants, many of them have a better culture than Americans. You're talking about?
Yeah, in regards to studying and career focus.
I mean, yeah, clearly Indian immigrants, Taiwanese immigrants, many immigrants make much more, and their marginal productivity is much higher. And a lot of that does have to do with just the fact that they have a different culture, for sure. I would say it's definitely a factor. I can speak from the economic standpoint, but not from the psychology standpoint. So from the economic standpoint, there are going to be many reasons why their marginal productivity is higher. A lot of it is going to be due to the fact that they are much more educated and they have much more skills than the average white American does. And that's just a fact. And that's reflected in how much they get paid.
Okay, gotcha. I think it's just important to look at, say, in general, how can we improve our existing labor pool? How can we make sure that Americans are trained for the jobs that are out there, for what's available, so that we don't necessarily have to rely on foreign labor to fill these positions, and many of which don't need to be filled by foreign labor because we do have Americans who can do those jobs. Sure, I see validity, especially with the O1 visa, the Einstein visa. That's the top of the top talent. But with regards to H1B, we're taking in a lot of folks who are not performing that high skill labor that is strongly in demand, and we have Americans who could fill those jobs, but instead it's the government saying, come on in, it's okay if you undercut our people, we don't care.
Yeah, I mean, so the thing is there's always a shortage of jobs. I think this is like really important to understand. There's always a shortage of jobs because there's a price for stuff. The price implies that something is scarce. The reason that the chair costs something and you have to pay something for it is because there can't be an infinite amount produced. That's what makes it an economic good. An economic good, the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied. That's why air is a good and it's not an economic good. The quantity demanded for air is much less than the supply, so there's no price for air. It's free. Okay, so there's always a shortage of labor. There's that's literally the constraint on economic goods is labor. So we always need more of it. There's no shortage of how much the more labor we have, the better. If the world population was 15 times what it is now, we'd all be much better off, generally speaking, if they could get an economy and produce stuff. Everybody produces stuff, right? So immigrants they're like, Craig, Americans being unemployed, the reason that looking at immigrants undercutting American workers is not, I think, is the wrong way to look at this. The right way to look at this is we all want to be we all want to do what's best for human flourishing. What's the best for human flourishing? And the way that you're going to allow humans to flourish is by allowing them to accumulate capital and skills. And a very easy way to do that, the easiest, like literally the easiest way I could think of, if you had power to do something that would increase world wealth double in a very short period of time, what would you do? And there's very few things I could think of, but one of the things I could do very easily, relatively easily relative to other things, would be to make it so that you could let people who have talent get into companies or countries that have a lot of capital. It's very simple. And them producing stuff is not taking away from society. It's helping society, right? Them working jobs is not taking away from society. They're obviously making money because they're producing things. Nobody just pays you just for the heck of it, unless it's the government or something. But these companies are paying them simply because they're providing value and they're helping whomever, Americans, whatever, in many different ways. And so they get rewarded for that. They're rewarded with more capital for employing it productively. So, I mean, if we didn't allow immigration, you would see the economy's capital would not be accumulating nearly as fast, if at all, really. I mean, it's been one of the huge booms for the United States economy, despite all the restrictions that we have recently. We've had a sizable amount of immigrants come in recently.
Understandable. And as say, for instance, looking at this from the standpoint of being survival of the fittest, do we as a society need to influence that? Is that something that you believe is our role?
I just don't know if survival of the fittest is. I'm not sure that's the way to look at it. I just look at it from the standpoint of how can humans flourish as much as possible, and if you allow them to trade with one another, as many people trading as possible, freely as possible, if people are able to buy and sell capital freely and own their capital, then you're going to see world wealth accumulate very fast, and you're going to see people get out of poverty really fast, and you're going to see human flourishing much more than any other economic system. So, I think the North Star here should just be human flourishing, and we should look at that. And if you look at if our North Star is human flourishing, then free immigration is a no-brainer. It's literally a no-brainer. The benefits are just so enormous. It's literally unbelievable.
Okay, I see where you're coming from, though I think we have to look at the other factors. For instance, the fact that it depresses wages, raises housing costs, unemploys Americans, brings the unemployment rate higher, as well as increases welfare costs. Then there's significant downside to it that needs to be considered.
Everything you said it's actually the opposite. It makes welfare more solvent. It makes it so that more Americans are employed. Many are employed by immigrants. You said a few other things. Unemployment is a function. Unemployment. So once Switzerland is a good example. They had millions of immigrants come in, which were a huge size of the population at the time, back in the 1960s, and unemployment was zero. They had zero unemployment that whole time. So, but they had a gold standard, and they didn't have as much fiduciary media they didn't have manipulation of the interest rates the same way that we had here. They were one of the last countries that went off the gold standard, and they had virtually no unemployment. So it can't be because of immigrants. Empirically, that would be false. The unemployment would be caused by a number of different factors. Minimum wage laws, restrictions, regulations, taxes all have to do with the fact that you can't produce enough. Your marginal productivity is not high enough to be hired by a company. A company has to justify hiring you based on the cost that it actually is associated, including the taxes that they have to pay for you, the regulations that they have to comply with for workers, all that stuff. So I promise you, the unemployment is not being caused by immigrants. Now, a job could be taken by an immigrant, but also there's another job that's going to be opened up for you. Right? There's not a finite amount of jobs, Craig.
No, I'm not saying that. But I am saying that, look, if you have consistently the jobs that you're looking for are being taken up by immigrants, then it's like, how do I get a job in the field that I am skilled in if those jobs get sucked up by people who are being paid 18% less? That's the problem.
There's going to be more. There's going to be more jobs. There's no shortage, right? That's the thing you're not understanding. There's no shortage of amount of jobs that could exist. There's no shortage there's no shortage of computers that people want. There's no shortage of it. We just economize and decide how much we want. We allocate based on the production possibilities frontier, I guess. And you would decide, okay, well, how many computers do I want to produce, and how many laptops, or how many computers do I want to produce, and how many phones do I want to produce? Whatever it is, I mean, I think you're looking at this in the wrong way. We're all going to make more money because our capital stock is going to go higher long term with immigrants. Mm-hmm. The capital stock will increase, and everybody's going to get paid more in the end. Right? Without immigrants, there's no Steve Jobs. Without immigrants, there's no NVIDIA, right, here in the United States. Without immigrants, there's several huge transformational technologies and companies that were created by immigrants that never happened. Mm-hmm. And are we better off with electricity?
Yes.
Are we better off? Are we better off with? Are we better off with the iPhones? Are we better off with Apple? I mean, it's the debate. It's so overwhelmingly obvious that it's just better for us.
Well, I suppose there's a difference in what you're saying regarding no immigration versus having limited immigration. And I think that's the key there, is that yes, we can have controlled borders, we can accept who we need where we need them, but we don't have to accept everyone and anyone, because inherently you are going to have people unemployed when their labor is undercut. That's just the inherent problem of it. There's no way around that. Sure, new jobs could be created and you could have entrepreneurs among some of those immigrants, but you're also going to have many who are in those lower level positions where the H1B is marketed as something that's supposed to be high skilled labor, and that's not what it's being used for.
Yeah, I mean, you said, let me make sure I understand what you said. So you said, okay, so yeah, immigrants, they can undercut American jobs, and sure, there could be other jobs created, but not enough, like essentially, you're saying?
Right, like not every immigrant is going to be an entrepreneur, and many of the people we're taking in through H1B, they're not the Steve Jobses, they're not the Elon Musks.
Right.
This isn't the O1 visa, and yes, there's surely people in the H1B who are talented, but that doesn't justify bringing in thousands of, say, accountants or cooks or cashiers when we don't need them.
I mean, immigrants are twice as entrepreneurial as Americans are. Twice as entrepreneurial. So, and also companies don't have to employ one person. They employ a lot of people. They can employ a lot of people, at least. So, right. So, I mean, if they're, really what you need to do is you just need to let the market figure this out. Right. I think this is like really the biggest deal. Like someone can ask you how many loaves of bread, like Friedrich, Hayek said one time that like someone asked him how many loaves of bread should exist. And he's like, I don't know, whatever the market decides. And then many people say, well, how many people should come into the United States? And you could say you cap it at this. Why not let the market figure it out? Just let private owners of capital decide what they should do with their property, what they should do with their capital. If they do it effectively, everybody's going to be richer, our capital stock will increase, and everybody will be better off, essentially. And the amount of jobs will actually increase. Actually, I think it's funny whenever, I know this is kind of off topic, but I have to say this. It's kind of funny whenever politicians talk about like, oh, I created all these jobs and stuff. The idea is actually to make it so that people work the least amount possible with the most amount of output. So you want people to have the highest marginal productivity possible. It would be the best if nobody had to work and we just get all the stuff we want, all the economic goods we want. Obviously, we'll never get there really, because we'll always have to economize and decide what we want, because we only have so many factors of production available. We only have so much capital, so we can only produce a certain amount of economic goods. But that could grow over time as we accumulate more capital. But I think it's I kind of forgot where I was going with it. Yeah, the jobs thing. Yeah, the jobs. So I like whenever a politician talks about I created all these jobs, I think it's kind of funny because most people don't really want second and third jobs. People want to work as little as possible and get the most amount of output as possible. As much money as possible for the least amount of input, most output per unit of input, right? So, and that's what happens over time as capital stock increases. Your productivity is so much higher, and that's why we're so rich today. But yeah, I mean. It's a long discussion with immigrants, but I think it should just be looked at from the human flourishing standpoint, from the value creation standpoint. Private owners of capital, they can employ it how they'd like to without restrictions in a free society. What's going to allow them to use it productively? The businesses that hire the best workers that are and they're paying them an appropriate price based on their marginal productivity are going to keep their capital. When they create compelling goods and services with the capital and labor that they employ, they'll maintain their capital and grow it. The businesses that wrongfully hire workers that aren't producing a lot of economic value and they're paying them more than their economic value suggests that they should be paid, they're going to lose their capital. They're not going to be creating compelling goods and services, and the market is going to show that, and they will be exposed and lose their capital. So this really just goes back to property rights.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Well, thanks for all that. Appreciate it. We upload 3 times a week. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. If you'd like to reach out to us, feel free at youthbombs@alatrarepublicans.com, and have a great day. Bye.